First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Rod Fensham. Rod's an ecologist who has published extensively on the flora and vegetation of Queensland. He's currently a professor at the University of Queensland and a principal botanist at the Queensland Herbarium and Biodiversity Science, Department of Environment, Science and Innovation. So Rod is going to talk to us about coexistence of rainforest and wet sclerophyll forest, lessons from the 2019 fires. Over to you, Rod.
Thanks, Kate.
I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
Sure.
Yep.
Try and be on time. I'm here also to talk about the 2019 fires and the footsteps of Tony's talk. Slightly different emphasis, I hope, and maybe that'll wake us up a bit in the afternoon. Our collective consciousness as Europeans, which most of us are in this room, in relation to fire is from Europe, obviously, and maybe dominated by the Fire of London, which was a 17th century event that destroyed lots of houses in London. But the collective consciousness of Aboriginal people, or the ones I know, is something completely different when it comes to fire. My Aboriginal family on the Tiwi Islands talk about fire as a sort of cleaning mechanism, and just like we would vacuum our house, they clean the bush with fire. And as an ecologist, pondering the relationship, or my relationship with the Australian environment and the Australian environment that burns, I have come to recognise that if you're an organism living in the environments of Australia that do get burnt, then you're probably going to be quite well adapted to fire. And our hypothesis should be, prove to me why you're not going to be able to survive fire, because we do live in a continent dominated by fire for at least 1 million years. And eucalypts are superbly well adapted, and acacias are superbly well adapted, and presumably most of the other plant species are superbly well adapted, with the obvious exception of rainforest. So rainforest is an environment which is fire retardant and has fire-sensitive species in it, and it's also a repository of a huge proportion of our biodiversity, particularly here in the subtropics and the tropics, where if you pick up Mangroves to Mountains, our local flora bible, there's a whopping great section on rainforest, and nearly all of the species in the rainforest section are Mangroves to Mountains, which takes up about a third of the book, you will only find in rainforest. So it's an environment where never the twain shall meet. It's like a very clearly circumscribed world that has its own species, and it just so happens that it rarely, if ever, burns. Okay, fast forward to 2019 fires. I was at a wedding in the bush, and I was quite drunk, and we eventually went to bed, and I was lying in this paddock on my swag, as I do, and the wind was so ferocious, picked up my sleeping bag and just threw it 100 metres away. And I remember thinking in my half-drunken state, wow, this is pretty wild weather. We don't see this very often. And maybe it's extraordinary. And I pondered the existence of these two worlds. The left hand is the subtropical rainforest. You're all familiar with it. It's closed canopy, lots and lots of tree species, ferns in the ground layer. But one of the most important things about the rainforest is that it's a really active compost heap. So the gardeners amongst us know what I'm talking about. There's a high turnover of the material on the ground, and there's not a lot of fuel, and maybe that partly explains, along with the microclimate, why it doesn't seem to burn. And adjacent to the subtropical rainforest, we have areas in Queensland that we might call wet sclerophyll, which is I've always thought it's a bit of a dumb term. We inherited it from down south. And as I'll try and lead you to believe, our version of what we call wet sclerophyll in the subtropics is really something quite different than from what we call wet sclerophyll in the temperate part of the world. Anyway, standing in the wet sclerophyll forest, which is basically the same as subtropical rainforest, except it's got these giant sclerophyll trees, either eucalypts or Lophistemon or Syncarpia, Myrtaceae dominans. the biggest trees in our part of the world, poking up through the rainforest, is standing. I've been visiting these places for years, and I went, how on earth did these forests ever burn? You know, we're led to believe that the Myrtaceae need fire, but these environments are just like rainforest, and they're a compost heap, and they're closed canopy, and they've got this moist microclimate, and I don't think I'll ever be able to see the day that they burn. I don't know how we're ever going to sort of like get fire back into these systems, which was part of the belief as to what we needed to do, because these fires actually may or may not depend on fire for their existence. And so, lying on that paddock, I thought, wow, maybe this is the day when the wet sclerophyll and maybe even the rainforest can burn, and maybe we do have a climate change event and the whole world's gone way out of whack, bearing in mind that, you know, I thought that rather unlikely, given that the rainforest is what it is and it must have been around for millions of years. Anyway, I finally got to visit these environments, and what I saw was something quite magical, because the rainforest puts out fire. I always knew the rainforest puts out fire, but this fire was something else. It was on the back of a really, really intense drought. The whole world was crunchy, dry, and the wind was howling, and these are precisely the conditions that burn down Melbourne or Hobart and roast the tallest angiosperm forests in the world in southern Australia. These really intense fires, and why this was the conditions that I was expecting to see. And perhaps the rainforest would burn. But the rainforest does something incredibly magical. It puts the fire to the ground, the fire trickles along for about 20, 30 metres and then goes out miraculously. And then we got reports of the impact of the 2019 fires, and it was all, you know, rainforest is finally burnt, we've lost all this rainforest. And I thought, are these statistics not quite compatible with what I saw, but maybe I didn't see all the world, you know, just saw a little bit of it, and maybe there was rainforest that burnt, and maybe this was a mega fire, or whatever you want to call it, that was out of the realm of history. So we decided to have a look at the problem. The first thing we did, I knew that the mapping that reports, that intersects with the fire scars, that reports these large areas of rainforest were burnt, were wrong. I knew that the rainforest, lots of the wet sclerophyll, which is the rainforest with the big giant Myrtaceae, was captured within the mapping as rainforest. So the first thing we needed to do was sort out that mapping, which was relatively easy to do with really nice modern imagery. So we remapped the fire scar, remapped the vegetation within the fire scars, and as Tony pointed out, most of the fire was along the Great Dividing Range in New South Wales, but some of it trickled up into Queensland and a little bit down into Victoria as well. So here's the fire, and here's where we managed to find sites where there was a rainforest next to a wet sclerophyll forest, and we could start to drill into the differences. But let's just look at the history of the weather. So this is two places where we've got weather stations coinciding with those two blobs of burnt country. And that's the 12-month rainfall on the top. And you can see the depth of the drought here preceding the fire. And it's pretty dry, right? Yeah. And then the bars on the top is what you probably should be focusing your vision on. The orange ones is where FFDI, which is this measure of forest fire danger. It's basically a combination of how dry it is, how windy it is, how low the humidity is. And they're the days that we need to be really worried about if we live in a big forest, wherever that may be. And the red bar, so the orange bars is where FFDI is greater than 50. I have a friend who lives in the Dandenongs, which is probably one of the most fire-prone environments in Australia. I said, what's your fire plan? He said, when FFDI is more than 50, I leave for the day and sacrifice all my belongings. I don't want to be around. I don't want to be around when the roads are busy. I go to the beach. So that's my mate's fire plan on these days. And the red bars is where FFDI more than 50s coincided with a walloping big drought. And you can see it occurred in 2019, but lo and behold, it's not even unique in the last 100 years. They do happen. They have happened in the past. So the results of the remapping gave a very big different picture from the initial reports, and it turned out that I've just got these, this slide around the wrong way, by the way, I've just realised. It turns out that 20% of the rainforest burnt, or 19 actually, and 57% of the wet sclerophyll burnt. So a lot of the the rainforest that was reported as having been burnt was actually wet sclerophyll, and about 19% of the rainforest did burn. And you might say, well, that's not an insignificant number, and indeed it's not an insignificant number, and we haven't got a way of teasing it out, but from what I saw, nearly all of that 19% will be previously logged subtropical rainforest, and we heard about the history of logging in subtropical rainforest, and a lot of it's really smashed around by that logging. It compromises the canopy, builds an understory of lantana, and makes this incredibly fire retardant, magically fire retardant rainforest system. It makes it able to be burnt. So, yeah, my student Ollie, he went in and measured the trees in these pairs, and so the x-axis of the different sized trees with the little ones on the left, 5 for you, and big trees on the right, and they're rainforest trees, the green bars, and then each of those numbers is a pair of graphs of rainforest next to a wet sclerophyll, and you can see that the big sclerophyll giants, the red things, are not being born regularly. There's no little ones. They're all sort of scattered through the forest at different sizes, but not little babies, right? And that's presumably because they may or may not have been born on the back of a previous fire. So the next thing we tried to address with this plot data and measurements we did in the forest was, why does the wet sclerophyll seem to burn and the rainforest not? And two obvious answers. One is that there's twice the basal area, you know, the size of the area of the trees. There's twice the area of trees in the wet sclerophyll where you've got those giant Myrtaceae emergence than there is in pure rainforest. So simply more trees equals more fuel. And also and that's manifest in our measurements of the fuel, where there's 40 tonnes per hectare in a wet sclerophyll forest and only about 20 in a rainforest, in that really active compost heap. And then Ollie buried these bags of litter in the forest, some of them wet sclerophyll litter and some of them rainforest litter, and lo and behold, the wet sclerophyll species decay much more slowly, the line at the top, than the rainforest litter, which is soft and juicy to decomposing organisms and has this rapid turnover in the composting forest. So basically, what we're proposing is that the wet sclerophyll is naturally a bit flammable, but only on really rare weather events. And the rainforest is, if you leave it undisturbed, and this is consistent with its evolutionary background, these things have been around a long time and have, weathered the vicissitudes of climate change in the past. They're just amazingly fire retardant. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing of nature that they can do that in an environment which can have very deep droughts. And then these giant Myrtaceae are presumably born on the back of fires, and lo and behold, they're born on the back of the 2019 fires. If you go to Binnaburra now and go for a walk, you'll see brush box about that big, and they're popping up, and they've all germinated on the back of that fire event. But the fire doesn't kill the forest like it does down south. It actually just trickles around the wet sclerophyll forest because the rainforest subcanopy is doing its magic and suppressing the fire, and the fires trickle around. They don't kill the big trees, and they kill some of the rainforest, which has to resprout, and you'll probably not see another fire event for another 50, 100 years when you get another generation of these giant Myrtaceae, and indeed the giant Myrtaceae need these fire events. So there's nothing particularly weird and unusual about the 2019 fires when it comes to wet sclerophyll forest. They have not only seen it before, but they actually need it to give birth to the tallest trees in our part of the world. And those fires are nothing like the stand replacing fires in their temperate equivalent, the mountain ash forests of southern Australia and perhaps the karri forests in Western Australia, I'm not sure, which are completely annihilated by fire. They don't really have rainforest understories that suppress fire. They have quite flammable species in the understory, principally these tree daisies that roast the fire and roast Melbourne and roast Sydney and roast Hobart occasionally, unlike our wet sclerophyll forests, which are a different beast altogether. And the reason that we have these beautiful giant trees.
Thank you, Rod.